Y'all remember the hokey pokey? Yeah, I know I'm going there to start this sermon. I'm sorry. I'm not going to make you stand up and do it. But you remember, it goes, okay, put your right hand in, right hand out. You put your right hand in, and for some reason you shake it all about. And then you do the hokey pokey, and you turn yourself around, and that's what it's all about, right? And then what do you do after you put your right hand in? You put your left hand in. And then after you put your right hand in and your left hand in, anyway, you keep putting stuff in, right? Hold on to that thought. We're going to come back to it. So, each week during this series, we've been reading from two books. The Book of God and the Book of Seuss. Revelation 7. I forgot my glasses. I'll do my best here. Revelation 7 through 8, sorry. The message to the church in Philadelphia. Write this. These are the words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. I know your works. Look, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. And from Dr. Seuss, Oh, the Places You'll Go, somewhere about page 25, we read this. Oh, the places you'll go. There is fun to be done. There are points to be scored. There are games to be won. And the magical things you can do with that ball will make you the winningest winner of all. Fame. You'll be famous as famous can be, with the whole wide world watching you win on TV. Except when they don't. Because sometimes they won't. I'm afraid that sometimes you'll play lonely games too. Games you can't win because you'll play against you. Open doors and places to go. The Bible and Dr. Seuss, that's what we've been talking about here for the past few weeks, and we're going to talk about it here for another few more weeks to lay ahead. And what we've seen so far is that God opens doors for us, like the church in Philadelphia, and God opens doors for us for the purpose of us walking through those doors. You see, our lives are to be marked by growth and adventure and challenge and movement. That's the first thing to know. That the fulfilled life that God has for us is about moving. It's about going over staying. It's about always looking for doors that have been opened for us. God's life, God's way for us, comes with a preference. And it's a preference for action over inaction. That was the first thing. Then, building on that, last week we talked about, well, sometimes we come to these doors and it's not exactly clear which door is best for us. And how do we decide? Is this door open? Is this door not open? Is that door better than this door? Which door do we choose? And we talked about how to make wise decisions when we decide to open and walk through doors. Today I want to take the next step from there, which is actually kind of the crucial step, which is how do you actually take a step through the door? How do you cross the threshold? Because that step can be the hardest step of all of them. And here's the reason why it's the hardest step of all of them. Well, it goes back to Dr. Seuss. Because sometimes we play lonely games too, games you can't win because you play against you. What are the games we play against ourselves? My dad, when I was a little kid, he was a teacher and a coach, and he ran the swimming pool in the small town that we lived in. And then back in those days, you actually had diving boards. And my brother and I would go to the swimming pool every day because, well, we got in free. And, that's what you did. And we got to where we could, get pretty good at this stuff. And we could go off the low board and the high board, and I could do front flips and back flips and all that kind of stuff. And that stuff never scared me. But there was one thing that never made sense to my brain. And that was to do with a gainer, when you jump off forward but flip over backwards in the same time. I could watch other people do it, and I knew it could be done, and my brother could do it. He's older than me, and so he would tease me that I couldn't. But it didn't work to my brain because the physics of this don't make sense to me, how you can jump one way and flip anyway. So, but being what I was and having the brother that I did, I was going to do this. And so you get up on the board, and you ask, how do you just do it. Just do it. Okay? And so you go up and no. You go, no. It's like, yeah. And of course now, but this time I'm getting grief because everybody's watching. And okay, here we go. And so finally, you know what happens, of course. You go and you jump and you stop. No! Right when you go, right? And what happens? Exactly. You go about this far and freeze and drop like a rock. Splat right into the water. And here's what this taught me. There are times in life where you either have to go the whole way or don't go at all. You can't get to the end of the board, take a jump, and then say, nah, don't think so. It just doesn't work well. We play a game against ourselves that we always end up losing when we go half-hearted and halfway. Whether it be in diving or in life, one sure way to make sure we go splat is to go at it half-hearted. And it reminded me of a scripture. It's not the scripture that's in your bulletin. I reserve the right to change my mind, and I did. And so instead of reading from what I was going to read from this morning, I actually want to read from the book of James, where this old church leader writes this. It says, if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given you. But ask in faith, never doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For the doubter, being double-minded and unstable in every way, must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. I never liked that passage because I like to keep my options open. I like to kind of hedge my bets whenever I get a chance. And I don't think what James is telling us here is that we should never have doubts about anything ever. That's really not the point. God gives us the ability to have doubts. God gives us a healthy skepticism in things. That's part of wisdom, is to ask questions about, is this right or not? So it's not about never doubting anything. But what I think James is telling us is it's okay to doubt, but it's not okay to live there permanently. Because we cannot live in continual indecision. We cannot keep all of our options open forever. We can't live our lives never fully committed to anything. Because living like that is what James says is like being tossed to and fro by the wind. You go over here, you go over here. You get pushed this way, you get pushed that way, but you never really land anywhere. If we live our lives continually refusing to make decisions and following through with those decisions, instead of keeping us safe like we think it's going to, what it actually does is secure us in our failure. Because when you go about life that way, you're basically going to be going off a diving board half-hearted, and you're going to end up going splat. Because it takes us being fully invested if we're going to succeed in some things. You see, to borrow again from Dr. Seuss, sometimes once we make that decision to walk through the door that God has opened for us, we decide we're going to do this, but then we play that game against ourselves. Because we kind of had trouble making the decision, probably. It may have been a big deal. And now that we finally decided, okay, I'm going to do it, as soon as you step that way, what do? Maybe I shouldn't. And we start doubting the decisions that we've made. In the world of purchasing things, there's a term for this. It's called buyer's remorse, right? You've all been there. This is human nature. Everybody's been there. You buy a car, and what happens? The next week, there's a better car for a better price, and you go, why didn't I wait? You buy a house, and immediately it's like, why didn't we buy the one next door is better than ours? Yeah, whatever. If you make a major purpose, it's human nature. It just is part of life. This is, luckily for us, by the way, retailers understand this, and they build penalties into taking things back. And so they make, because buyer's remorse is such a real thing that if it was easy to go back on these things, most of us would. It's no big deal. It's human nature in that part of the world. But it's a bigger deal for us when we have buyer's remorse in the doors that God opens for us, those ones that are spiritual and personal and oftentimes relational. You can't go back on those kind of decisions either. Because if we never fully commit to a thing, or even more importantly, if we never commit to a person, it causes us to walk partway through that door, but never fully invest in what's on the other side of it. Because we're always looking back through the door at what we could have done differently. John Ortberg, who I've got some of the ideas from this series from, he says it this way. He says, I'm not in charge of what doors will be presented to me in my life. He says, I'm not in charge of what's behind those doors that God opens for me. But what I am in charge of is this one dynamic, he says. What I'm in charge of is this, is that when a door is opened, I get to choose how to respond. And that sometimes what you do after the door opens that makes the biggest difference. Because it's better to go through the wrong door with your best self than to go through the best door with your wrong self. I think that's a wise line. That sometimes in life it's actually better to go through a wrong door with your best self than to go through a best door with your wrong self. Meaning, we can't allow this buyer's remorse. We can't allow this never giving our best selves to the decisions we make. We can't allow that to sabotage our own lives. Brene Brown wrote a book called Daring Greatly. It's one of the 5 best books I've read in the last 10 years. I love this book. And she coins a term in there that fits. So one of the reasons I love this book is it dovetails so nicely. She's a social scientist, but so much of what she writes about dovetails with our understanding of the Christian life really well. And one of the things she talks about is living wholeheartedly. And that's really what we're talking about here, is living wholeheartedly. And what she gets to is this, is that when we make these decisions in our lives, it's scary. It's scary to walk through these doors. And the reason it's scary to walk through these doors is these are consequential decisions. These are meaningful decisions. And when we follow through on these decisions, it makes us, by the very nature of them, vulnerable. Because we're putting ourselves out there. And nobody likes to be vulnerable. It's human nature. Nobody likes it. And so we make these decisions and we step through and we get to this and we ask ourselves, what if I'm wrong? What if I look like a fool? What if this doesn't work? What if I ended up hurting my family more than helping my family? What if I've just submarined my career? What have I done? I'm going to die. I'm going to be old and living in a van down by the river. You know, that kind of Saturday Night Live thing, right? I mean, that's we start doing this to ourselves. And so what she talks about is to be wholehearted, to not go back on these things, to not live kind of scattered. It takes a great deal of courage. It takes courage because we feel vulnerable So it takes courage to decide. It takes courage to be all in. It takes courage to walk through the open door. And then it takes courage to invest ourselves fully in whatever it is we find on the other side. Wholehearted living. The Bible is full of examples and admonitions for living wholeheartedly, particularly when it comes to living wholeheartedly for God. In fact, there's way more decisions. I mean, from Cain and Abel to the book of Revelation, from Paul to Moses to David to Amazon. I mean, all through, Jesus himself taught about it many times. You can't put your hand to the plow and look back. All these kind of things. About being wholehearted, there's more than you can talk about in one sermon. If you want to follow up on this little homework, just Google this. This is what I did to get started on this. I just Googled scriptures on wholeheartedness, and there's a dizzying array of scriptures that speak to this. Just do that when you get home. But the point is that this, instead of going to all these things, is that this helps us understand the importance of this next step. That God expects us to be wholehearted in our lives. That we actually have to take steps forward and not keep hedging our bets all the time. And that step can be the hardest thing of all, because it's that mind game we play, right? What if I'm wrong? What's going to happen with it? That game that we play against ourselves that Dr. Seuss talks about, yeah, that's hard. And that's why we have to keep going and to have the courage to step across the threshold. It's pretty safe to say that God's preferred way for us actually walking through the doors he's opened for us is to go through not half-heartedly, but to go through wholeheartedly. And if we are going to overcome our fears and overcome that lonely game we play against ourselves that we can't win, I wish I had a magic formula for you, but I don't. Here's what it takes. It takes us grabbing a handful of courage. It requires making ourselves vulnerable to failure. And it means that we're going to have to put our whole hearts into some things if we're not going to go splat. If we're going to do what the open door requires of us and take advantage of those doors that God opens, we're going to have to learn from the hokey pokey. Right? Because what happens when you get to the end of the song? You can start by putting your right hand in and your left hand in and that in, and that's enough of that. But the end of the song says what? You put your whole self in. And that's what it takes. If we are going to cross the threshold well, if we are going to walk fully into what it is that God has prepared for us, we have to put our whole self in. So I don't know what's going on in your life. But sometimes we come to parts of our life where we're kind of stuck. And my guess is if you're in that place, it may be that you know what door you're supposed to walk through. It may be that you really kind of have some clarity about what you're supposed to do next. But man, it's scary to do it. Well, here's what I want to encourage you to do. I want you to step up onto the diving board. And I want you to take 2 or 3 good hard steps and just go. Just jump. And just do the best you can. Because you know what happens when you do? Well, you might still go splat. It's possible. But you know what happened when I finally did it the right way? It worked. I still don't know how it worked. It doesn't make any sense in my brain how it works. But it did.